Chief Roy Halloran stood in the doorway of the armory with his arms crossed like a barred gate, and he did not move when the small woman reached past him for the long rifle case on the rack. His hand came down on the lid. Not hard, just enough. "Comms doesn't touch the long gun," he said, loud enough for the 3 operators behind him to hear, because a thing said quietly to one person is only a correction, and a thing said loudly to a room is a law. Ines Lindqvist looked at his hand on the case, then up at his face, and she did not flinch, did not argue, did not do any of the small nervous things people do when a bigger person decides to make them smaller. She let her arm drop. "You carry the radio," Halloran went on, warming to it now because the room was listening. "You keep the batteries dry. You call in the birds. That's the job. The rifle's for shooters, and you're not one. I've seen your qual card. Marksman, 3rd class. Cute." A couple of the men laughed, not cruelly, just the way men laugh when the biggest one in the room makes a joke, and it's easier to laugh than not. Halloran was not a stupid man, and he was not a coward. He was a genuinely excellent operator, with 11 years and 2 tridents worth of dead friends behind his certainty, and that certainty had hardened into a simple rule. He decided who belonged on the line, and she did not. He believed it the way you believe the floor will hold you. Ines said nothing. She picked up the crate of spare batteries she'd actually come for, settled it against her hip, and walked out into the gray, wet cold of the tidal island where the outpost sat. And Halloran watched her go with the satisfied blankness of a man who has never once been wrong about a person and doesn't yet know that his qual card and hers had been printed by a system that never asked her the only question that mattered. She did not yet know it either, that in 4 days he would say her name into a radio in a voice she had never heard him use, and that everyone in earshot would go silent. If a woman being told to stay in her lane and then dismantling a war around her is a story you want to see all the way to the end, do this first. Subscribe, and in the comments drop the name of the city you're listening from right now, because it genuinely stuns me how far these stories travel. From a phone in a kitchen in Manila to a truck cab crossing Nebraska at 2 in the morning. Stay to the end, because this one doesn't peak where you think it does. The wounded man who begs her to run and the chief who begs for her help are 2 different men. And the hardest thing she does in 4 days isn't the shot everyone talks about afterward. It's the second one. Now let me rewind, because to understand what happened on that causeway, you have to understand what nobody bothered to read in her file. The outpost had no name anyone used, just a grid and a nickname, the Nail, because it sat on a tidal island at the head of a cold northern inlet, connected to the mainland by a single stone causeway that the sea swallowed twice a day and gave back twice a day, on a schedule as old as the moon. When the tide was in, the Nail was an island. When it was out, the causeway lay across the mudflats like a dropped ribbon, slick with weed and rime. Winter had come down off the mountains and settled on the water, and the mornings arrived as fog that froze to the antennas, and the men walked the perimeter with their breath hanging around their heads. It was a hard, ugly, beautiful place, and it was 100 miles from anything that could reach them fast. Ines had grown up in cold like this. She had grown up, in fact, on skis, with a rifle strapped across her back, because before she was petty officer, 2nd class Lindqvist, she had been a junior on a national biathlon squad. The sport almost no one in the room could name. 20 kilometers of skiing until your lungs were two torn bags, and your heart was a fist trying to punch out through your ribs. And then you skid to a stop at the range, and you have to put 5 rounds through a target the size of a coin, prone and standing, with all of that chaos happening inside your chest. The whole sport is a single question, asked over and over. Can you be perfectly still on the outside while everything inside you is screaming? Her coach, Petra Acre, still alive, still coaching, still sending Inez 2-line messages that read like slaps, had drilled one thing into her over 11 winters until it was not a technique, but a reflex. You do not fight the heartbeat, Petra said. You cannot win against your own heart. It is stronger than you, and it is always right. You wait for it. There is a stillness that lives in the gap between 2 beats, a door that opens for a fraction of a second and closes, and a shooter who tries to force the door will always miss. A shooter who learns to feel the door and step through it when it opens can do things that look, to people who have never felt it, like magic. Shoot in the space between, Petra said. The target doesn't care who you are. The target doesn't care what they say about you. The target is the one honest thing in your whole life. Inez had made 2 World Cup start lists at 19. Then her federation lost its funding, and her knee lost a ligament on a downhill in Rube Holding, and her family lost the farm, and she'd needed a job that paid and a bed that was hers. And the Navy had wanted a body and gotten, without ever knowing it, one of the finest cold-weather marksmen the sport had ever quietly produced. Nobody in her file had asked about biathlon. There was no box for it. So the box stayed empty, and a man like Halloran read the empty box and saw an empty woman. The green kid noticed before anyone else. Seaman recruit Ozzie Tran, 18, on his first deployment, so new he still said sir to the cook, had latrine and battery and coffee duty, which meant he saw everything and mattered to no one. The perfect witness. He was hauling a water can past the makeshift range one gray afternoon when he stopped, because the woman from comms was down at the end of it alone, cleaning a rifle. That was not what stopped him. It was the way she cleaned it, hands moving without her eyes, every motion landing exactly where it had landed 10,000 times before, a rhythm so smooth it looked slow and was not. She field stripped it, ran the bore, seated it, checked it, all without once looking down, her eyes fixed out past the berm on the gray line of the mudflats. And Ozzie thought, without the words for it, that he was watching something a person only got from doing a thing for a very long time. She caught him staring. "You'll spill your water," she said. He looked down. He'd spilled his water. When he looked up, she was already back to it, eyes on the flats, and Ozzie carried the empty can to the pump and told no one. Because who would he tell? And what would he even say? Just that the clerk cleaned a rifle like it was part of her arm. Doc Farrow had been a corpsman for 19 years and had stopped being impressed by people around year 6, which was why the men trusted him and why his quiet approval was the only currency on the nail that Halloran couldn't print. He'd watched Inez on the range one morning through the mist, not staring, just noting. That evening he sat down across from her, in the plywood galley with 2 cups of the terrible coffee, and pushed one across. "Where'd you learn to run a bolt like that?" "Biathlon," she said. "You wouldn't have heard of it." "I've heard of it," Farrow said. "Ski and shoot. Shoot with your heart coming out your throat. My daughter did junior Nordic in Anchorage. I know what that range does to a person's hands." Inez held the cup and said nothing for a moment, and it was the first time on that deployment anyone had said a true thing about who she was. "It ruins you for everything else," she said finally. "Once you've shot a coin off a table with your pulse at 190, a paper target in a warm room at your own pace feels like a lie." Pharaoh nodded slowly. He didn't tell her she was good or that he believed her. He just said, "Keep the batteries dry." And it was somehow the kindest thing said to her in weeks, because it meant he'd noticed the small work and respected it. And when he stood, he tapped the table twice, and that was the whole friendship, sealed. Later, the men gave him grief about it. Doc's got a favorite. He let it roll off. He'd learned to read who could actually do the job, and who only sounded like they could, and he'd stopped explaining the difference to people who'd rather laugh. Eli Brandt was 24 and could not stop talking about the baby. He'd shown everyone the ultrasound so many times the photo had gone soft at the corners. A girl, due in March, and he'd already picked the name and would tell you if you gave him 3 seconds. He was one of Halloran's shooters, the youngest, the team's designated marksman, which meant the long rifle in the case Halloran had guarded was, when it was carried at all, carried by Brandt. He was kind in the uncomplicated way very young men sometimes are, and he was the only operator who ever said good morning to Inez, like she was a person and not a fixture. 2 mornings before it all came apart, he found her checking an antenna cable in the cold and stood there rubbing his hands and told her the baby had gotten the hiccups on the last call. You could see it on the screen, this little jump, and he laughed at it, delighted. A grown man with a rifle laughing at a jump on a screen 10,000 miles away. "You'll be a good dad," Inez told him, and meant it, and he grinned and said he was going to teach the kid to fish. And then he went off to stand his watch, and that was the last ordinary conversation anyone on the nail would have for 4 days, though none of them knew it, because the tide was coming in and something else was coming in with it. It came at the seam of the tide, in the gray hour when the causeway was half drowned and the fog was thickest, which meant someone had watched the nail long enough to know exactly when it was hardest to reinforce and hardest to leave. The first sign was not a shot. It was the radios dying, not all at once, but one net at a time. A hiss where a voice should be, and Inez, in the comms hut, felt the wrongness of it in her stomach before her brain caught up, because she knew the sound of jamming the way. You know the sound of a stranger's foot on your stair. She keyed the backup set. Static. She keyed the HF. Static. "Chief," she said into the one net still breathing, "we're being jammed. All VHF is down. This is deliberate." And the world came apart in white light, and a sound like the sky being torn in half. The first mortar walked in across the northern bunker, and the second found the generator shed, and the third, the one that mattered, dropped onto the causeway approach, where the outer picket stood, and men who had been alive a second ago were simply parts of the morning now. And the fog lit up along the mud flats with the muzzle flash of 40 rifles, maybe more, a wave of fighters coming across the exposed flats and along the causeway. In the 1 hour of the day, the sea allowed it. The nail had been attacked from the only direction the sea permitted, at the only time it permitted it, by people who had done their homework, and inside the first 90 seconds, A third of the men who could fight were down. Inez went low and fast out of the hut, with the one radio that still worked strapped to her chest. And this is the part where a story like this usually says, she froze. And she did not freeze, because she had spent her whole youth learning to skid to a stop, with her heart at redline, and do fine work with shaking hands. And a body that has done a thing 10,000 times does not ask permission in the moment. She found Pharaoh already dragging a screaming man behind the fuel bladders and threw herself down beside them. "Where's the line?" she shouted over the noise. "There's no line," Pharaoh shouted back, packing a wound with both hands. "The picket's gone. Halloran's cut off on the north wall with 4 guys. They're going to come right up the causeway into the soft middle of us, and there's nobody in the middle." He looked at her once, hard, and she understood he was not telling her to run. He was telling her the truth because she was the only person there whose hands weren't already full of somebody's blood. 50 meters ahead of them, at the mouth of the causeway where the enemy was going to funnel, Eli Brandt was down. He'd taken it in the thigh, high, and the long rifle, his rifle, the coin shooter, the one Halloran guarded, was flung a body length from his hand in the mud, and Brandt was dragging himself towards the rocks with one good leg and a look on his face that was not fear for himself. When Inez reached him, low and fast under the cracking air, he grabbed her sleeve with a bloody hand and said the thing that would end up in the title of this whole story. Said it with the last of the certainty they'd all been raised on. "Run," Brandt said. "Get to the boats, Lindqvist. Get behind the rocks. You can't. You're not. Go, please. I'm not going to make it up, and there's 40 of them, and you have to run." He shoved the rifle away from himself, toward her, not as a weapon, but as a thing he wanted out of the mud, before he died on top of it. And that was the moment. Inez looked at the rifle in the mud. She looked at the mouth of the causeway where the first fighters were already coming out of the fog at a run, close, 40 meters, 30, into the soft undefended middle of the nail where the wounded lay. She did not run. She grabbed his rifle instead. The first thing she did was not shoot. The first thing she did was breathe. One long breath out, dropping her heart from panic rhythm towards something she could work with, and she rolled prone behind Brandt's own body and a low fold of rock, seated the rifle into her shoulder in the groove where a rifle had lived for 11 winters. And the world went quiet the way it always went quiet, the way Petra had promised it would, the noise sliding to the edges and the target sliding to the center. The lead fighter was 30 meters out and running hard, and Inez felt for the door between 2 heartbeats, and it opened, and she stepped through it. The shot was not loud to her. They never were, but Brandt heard it right next to his ear, and would say later it was the flattest, most matter-of-fact rifle report he'd ever heard. No drama in it at all. Just a click and a crack, and the man who was running fell like his strings were cut and did not get up. She was already on the second. The bolt worked under her hand, without her looking at it, brass spinning out, and the second man was 5 meters behind the first, and she took him between beats too, and the third and the fourth, 4 men in the space of 6 seconds, and the wave that had been about to roll over the middle of the nail hit a wall it could not see and did not understand, and broke against it. "Contact, causeway mouth, 4 down," Inez said into the radio on her chest, and her voice on the net was so level, so unhurried, that on the north wall Halloran heard it and did not recognize it. "Who is that?" he said. "Who's on the middle?" "Lindqvist," Pharaoh's voice came back, and there was something new in it. "It's Lindqvist. She's got Brandt's gun." Nobody answered that for a second, and in that second she killed 2 more. They adjusted because they were good. The fighters coming up the causeway stopped running into the open middle and started using it. The wrecked generator shed, the fold of the rock, the drowned pilings of the old jetty, and Inez had to work for every one of them now. And this is where the sport she'd been mocked for became the only thing keeping 30 people alive. A fighter broke from the shed to the pilings, exposed for less than a second, and she took him in that second. Mid-stride, a moving target with lead she didn't have to think about because she'd led 10,000 running targets on ranges from Östersund to Antholz. 7, Pharaoh called, because someone had to count, and she wouldn't. A man popped up from behind the drowned jetty to fire, and dropped back down, and popped up again 3 meters left. And she was waiting there when he came up between beats, and Pharaoh said, 8, in a voice going strange, and the enemy fire began, for the first time, to concentrate on the middle, on her, because they had finally identified where the wall was coming from. The rounds came for her then, and this is the first time in these 4 days she is truly, arithmetically, about to die. She saw the muzzle flashes swing toward her position across the flats. 4 of them. 5. A cone of fire tightening on the fold of rock, and she heard the rounds before she felt anything. The ones that missed high went past with a sound like fabric ripping. The ones that hit the rock in front of her face slapped it with a wet crack and threw stone chips that stung her cheek and drew blood. She didn't feel yet, and one round hit Brandt's rifle stock a hand's width from her grip, and the whole weapon jumped and rang like a struck bell. And she thought for a quarter second the shot had been hers going wrong before she understood it had come from the other direction. The mud in front of her leapt in a line, walking toward her face. Every instinct in a human body says, move, get up, get away. And Inez did the thing that separates the people who live from the people who don't in that exact moment. She stayed because she had already read that the fire was suppression, wild, aimed at where she was not quite, and moving would put her up into the accurate part of it. She pressed her cheek to the freezing stock, found her breath, found the muzzle flash that was the real threat. A man behind the shed corner, firing controlled pairs, the only disciplined shooter in the bunch. And she gave him the space between 2 beats, and he stopped firing forever. And the cone of wild fire, leaderless now, faltered. 9! Pharaoh breathed. Her cheek was bleeding. She hadn't noticed. Lindqvist. Halloran's voice, on the net, and it was tight in a way none of them had heard. He was pinned on the north wall with 4 men and a machine gun position keeping his head down, and no way to cross to the fight in the middle. He was, for the first time in his career, not the man who mattered. And to his credit, this is the thing about Halloran, he was better than his worst rule. The first thing out of his mouth was not an order, and was not a doubt. It was information. There's a heavy gun in the old boathouse on the causeway, 210 meters, you're 10 o'clock. It's got us pinned, and it's about to traverse onto the middle. If it gets on the wounded, everybody in that soft ground dies. I can't get an angle. Can you see it? A pause. He made himself say the next part, and it cost him something you could hear. Can you take it? Say the range again. Inez said. 210, Halloran said. 210, she repeated. And she was already shifting, already reading the boathouse, the black slot of the window, the machine gun's snout beginning to swing. This was not a body target. This was a gunner mostly behind cover, a sliver of shoulder and head in a dark window, and the gun would be on the wounded in 4 seconds. Overhead, the fog was breaking into cold rain, and the rain came slantwise on a wind off the water, and she felt it on her right cheek, and read it, half value, right to left, without a word to herself about it, the way she'd read the flags at every range she'd ever knelt on. She breathed out. Somewhere far back, a voice that was Petra's, and also just her own, said, "The target is the honest thing." And the gunner's shoulders shifted as he leaned into the traverse, and gave her, for 1 heartbeat's width, the side of his head. The door opened. She stepped through it. The rifle's report was that same flat crack, and 210 meters away, the machine gun stopped swinging, and its muzzle dropped and pointed at the mud and stayed there. "Guns down," Halloran said, and then said nothing, because there was nothing in his vocabulary for what he had just watched the clerk do. 10, said Pharaoh. "That's 10. And then quiet, only to her. "Kid, your face is open. Let me—" "Later," Inez said. She was already scanning. Because it wasn't over. Because it was never over when you thought it was. They tried the flanks. 2 teams peeled wide across the mudflats to come at the middle from the sides. And for 11 minutes, Inez was a defensive 1, tracking left, tracking right, taking men in the fractional exposures the flats allowed, and the count climbed 13, 15, and Pharaoh's voice grew hoarse from calling it and from the work of keeping Brant from bleeding out beside her, because he'd stayed there, in the open, packing that thigh wound one-handed while she shot over him. And this is the independent thing Doc Pharaoh did that changed everything. At Minute 8, he made a call no one ordered. He got on her working radio, and he lied. He called the base net 100 miles back, and he said, in the calm, flat voice of a man who has decided to gamble, that the nail had an active designated marksman holding the causeway and requesting the bird's guns be tasked to the northern boathouse and the flats on his mark. And he gave them a competence and an authority and a plan that did not officially exist in her name, so that when the aircraft finally clawed up through the weather, it came in knowing exactly where to put its fire, because a corpsman had decided to believe a woman the whole chain of command had filed under batteries. Dry, keep. The aircraft's cannon opened up on the flats, with a sound like the world tearing a thicker fabric. A deep, ripping roar, utterly unlike the flat crack of her rifle, and the flank teams that had almost reached the wounded were gone, and the attack, which had been a wave, became a retreat, became men running back across the causeway into the fog. And Inez took 2 more of them going, and then, deliberately, let the rest go, because they were running, and the wounded behind her were still bleeding, and her job had never been the count. 16, Pharaoh said, and looked at her. "Kid, it's done. They're running. Look at me. It's done." And Inez lowered the rifle and, for the first time, felt the cold, and felt her cheek, and felt her hands starting to shake now that the door didn't need to stay open. And she turned to Brant. He was gray. He'd given everything he had to that wound and to staying next to her, and now the tide of it was going out of him. She got her hands into the pack Pharaoh shoved at her, and she worked, because a biathlete's hands are also a farm kid's hands, and she'd wrapped enough torn things in her life, and she cinched the high tourniquet Pharaoh couldn't reach, and packed the wound, and held pressure with the whole weight of her small body. And Brant's eyes found her face, and there was blood on it, hers, and he thought he was looking at an angel or a ghost. He wasn't sure which, and he asked the question, "Am I gonna see the baby?" Not am I going to live. Am I going to see the baby? And the whole cost of the last 30 minutes was in it. Inez did not say the things people say. She did not say, "You're going to be fine," or "Hang in there," or any of the words that mean the speaker isn't sure. She put her forehead down close to his so he could see her eyes were not lying, and she said, "You'll hold her yourself. In March. You'll teach her to fish." A promise delivered as a fact, in the present tense, the way you'd tell someone the tide comes in twice a day. Brant believed her because there was nothing else in her face to believe. "Okay," he said, "okay." And he held on to that, and it held him. And the bird took him and 11 others off the nail an hour later, when the weather cracked, and Inez stood on the wet stone, with her cheeks stitched crooked by Pharaoh's field kit, and watched it lift into the gray, and did not let anyone see anything on her face at all. They thought that was the story. For about 4 hours, on the bleeding, half-wrecked nail, everyone thought the story was over. 31 men had come in, and 16 were dead in the mud, and the outpost had held, barely, and the clerk from comms had a count next to her name that nobody could quite say out loud. Halloran had come down off the north wall, and had not spoken to her, had not been able to, had stood at the edge of the range, where she was cleaning Brant's rifle again, hands moving without her eyes, and he had opened his mouth twice and closed it twice and walked away, because the thing he needed to say was too big to fit through the door. His pride had left open. Pharaoh dressed her cheek properly and told her she'd need a plastics guy for the scar, and she said good, and he understood she meant it, that she wanted the line on her face, and he didn't ask why. The tide came in and made them an island. The fog came down, and they were wrong that it was over, because the enemy commander, who had planned the morning attack so well, was still out there in the fog with the pieces of a broken force. And he was a proud man, too, and proud men do not lose a place like the nail and simply leave. He had one card left, and he had known about it the whole time, and he'd been saving it. The tide would turn at 1640, and the causeway would rise out of the sea for its evening hour, and the whole plan of the nail, the wounded who couldn't wait for another window in the weather, the surviving civilians from the fishing hamlet who'd sheltered inside the wire, the dozen walking casualties, was to move everyone across that causeway to the vehicles waiting on the mainland shore the instant the sea gave it back. Because if they stayed on the island the second night, cut off, with a third of them wounded, they would not survive an attack the enemy was surely rebuilding for. Everything depended on the causeway, which was exactly why, at 1610, with the sea just beginning to drain off the stones, Ozzie Tran, the water can kid, the witness, on the perimeter because they'd run out of unwounded men, and even he had a rifle now, saw a light out on the mainland end of the causeway where there should have been no light, and reported it. And Pharaoh looked through the spotting scope and went very still. There was a man at the mainland anchor of the causeway, at the base of the old stone arch, where the span was weakest, and he was crouched over a bundle, and the bundle had wires. And there were more wires running along the base of the arch, and a second man, and a third, working fast in the failing light. And Pharaoh understood the whole shape of it in one cold rush, and said the word that changed the afternoon. "They've wired the bridge." It was the perfect trap, and it had been the plan all along, not to take the nail by force. The commander had spent his assault learning he couldn't, or perhaps he'd never truly meant to. The plan was to make them need the causeway, and then take the causeway away. If the nail's survivors crowded onto that span at 1640 to escape, the enemy would drop the arch under their feet, and the whole column, wounded, civilians, children, the litter cases who couldn't run, would go into the mud and the rising sea. And if the survivors saw the charges and refused to cross, they'd be trapped on the island for the night, with no relief and no evac and no way to hold. And the enemy would come across the drained flats and finish them at leisure. Cross and die, or stay and die. The tide gave them their hour at 1640, and the sea would close the causeway again at 1740. 1 hour, and there was no other way off the nail. And 100 people's lives now sat on a single stone arch and a bundle of wires, and a man crouched over a detonator, 240 meters away in the last gray light of a winter afternoon, with snow beginning to come down out of the mountains. Pharaoh got on the net to the base and to the disabled command element and laid it out flat. And the answer that came back was the worst kind of true. The aircraft that had saved them at noon was gone, refueling 40 minutes out minimum, and the causeway window closed in 90. There was no time for the guns. There was no artillery in range. There was no other exit. There was a man with a detonator, and the only thing on the entire island that could reach him before he pressed it was a rifle. And there was one person on the island who could make the shot, and everyone knew who it was, and one of them could not stand it. Halloran had the radio in his hand. He was the senior man. The call was his to make, and to make it, he had to key the net and say a thing that would unmake the rule he'd lived by for 11 years, in front of every man on the nail, and the whole base net listening 100 miles back. He stood in the sleet at the edge of the range, where she was already lying prone, already reading the light and the falling snow and the 240 meters, already knowing, and he keyed the radio, and nothing came out. He tried again. Nothing. His jaw worked. A man who had shouted her down in an armory 4 days ago now could not make his own voice cross the small distance to her. Pharaoh watched him and didn't help him, because some doors a man has to walk through himself. Halloran pressed the transmit key a third time, and this time he got it out, and his voice on the net was not loud and was not certain, and was stripped down to something bare and shaking. "All stations, this is Halloran." A breath. "I've got charges on the causeway anchor. A trigger man, 240 meters, and 1 hour to move 100 people or lose them." Another breath, and everyone on that net, on that island, 100 miles away in the ops center, heard a chief say the next words, like they were being pulled out of him with a hook. "I need Lindqvist on the long gun. Inez, I need you." He let go of the key. The silence on the net after it was the loudest thing on the nail. Ozzy Tran, 40 meters away, heard the chief say her first name and felt the hair stand up on his arms and didn't understand why until much later. Pharaoh closed his eyes for 1 second, And Inez, prone in the sleet with the rifle already in the groove of her shoulder, keyed her own radio and said the only 2 words the moment needed. And they were not 2 words of triumph. They were flat and steady, and they were an old sports answer to a coach's call. On the gun. The shot was not a shot yet. It was a problem, and the problem was ugly. 240 meters was nothing to her on a range. But this was not a range. The light was dying by the second. The sun already down behind the mountains and the snow now coming thick. Big wet flakes that hung in the air and drank the last gray light and turned 240 meters into a shifting curtain. She had to read through and around. The triggerman was smart. He was down behind the low stone parapet of the old arch, showing nothing, a bundled shape with the detonator in his hands, and he would not need to show himself to press it. He'd press it the instant the column started across, by watching, and the column had to start across in minutes. And here was the trap inside the trap. She could not simply shoot at the first sight of him, because a wounded man's rifle and a dying light and a snow curtain meant she would get 1 shot, maybe, before he understood he was being hunted and simply pressed the trigger out of spite. She needed him to lean out and commit. She needed the instant he raised up to watch his kill and became, for less than a second, a target instead of a hidden hand. And she needed to know that instant was coming before it came, because a second of warning was the difference between a corpse and 100 corpses. She could not see that instant herself. She was reading the snow and the light and the range, and she had no attention left for the enemy's mind. She needed eyes that knew this particular man, that had fought him that morning, that could read the tell. And on the mainland shore, in the back of the aid vehicle where they'd taken him, on a litter, gray and half-conscious, with a phone scope patched into the nail's net, because a stubborn corpsman had rigged it before the bird left, was Eli Brandt. He'd watched these fighters all morning through his glass before they shot him. He knew how this commander's men moved, and when Pharaoh's voice came over the net asking, almost hopeless, "Is there anyone who's got eyes on the triggerman's habits? Anyone at all?" A weak voice that everyone thought had gone off the island came back on the frequency. "This is Brandt. Patch me the feed. I can spot her." The man who had begged her to run 4 days ago, who had shoved that rifle away from himself in the mud, was now going to call the impossible shot for the woman who'd taken it up. What followed took 40 seconds and felt to everyone listening like the rest of their lives. Brandt watched the triggerman's shape on the scope feed, snow blurred, hunched, and Inez lay in the sleet 100 meters and a whole island away, with her cheek on the freezing stock, and waited. And the first thing she did, again, was breathe. But she was not the woman she'd been at noon. She'd been shot at, cut. She'd carried a dying man's blood on her face for 6 hours. She'd been awake for a day and a half, and the cold had gone deep into her hands where a shooter cannot afford it. And her heart, when she checked it, was not steady. It was hammering, from the sprint to the firing point, from the exhaustion, from the plain animal fear of 100 lives on a single round. On a range, she shot with a calm heart. She did not have a calm heart. She had a heart at redline, and hands going numb, and a curtain of snow. And this exact catastrophe of the body, was the one thing in the world she had trained 10,000 hours to defeat. This was roop holding. This was every finish line range she'd ever skidded onto with her lungs on fire. "You do not fight the heartbeat," Petra said, from a lifetime ago, and from right beside her ear. "You wait for the door." She stopped trying to steady her heart. She let it pound. She sank into it, felt its rhythm, found in the middle of the hammering the tiny, recurring stillness between two beats. The door that opened and closed and opened and closed, no matter how hard the heart was working. Because the door does not care how fast the heart runs. The door is always there. "Columns moving," Pharaoh's voice tight. "First litters on the span." On the mainland, through the scope, Brant saw the triggerman's bundled shape shift, saw him gather himself, saw the specific way his shoulders rolled and his head came up as he raised to watch the column reach the fatal middle of the arch. The exact commit he'd seen these men make all morning before they fired. A single tell that would happen once and not again. "He's coming up," Brant breathed. And then with the last strength in him, the two words that were the whole of the trust that had grown between the man who said run and the woman who stayed. "Now, Inez." She was in the door when he said it. The triggerman's head and shoulders rose above the parapet into the falling snow, exposed for the width of a single heartbeat, and Inez Lindqvist stepped through the door between two beats of her hammering heart and broke the shot clean, and the flat crack of it went out across the drained flats and the snow. And 240 meters away, the man with the detonator in his hands went backward off the parapet and did not press it, and the charges on the causeway anchor stayed silent, and 100 people walked off the nail across the stone arch into the last of the light while the sea came up gently underneath them, right on time. Afterward, they did not believe it, and this is the part that matters as much as the shot. When the story reached the base, the clerk, the comms girl, a hostile detonator man dropped with a single round in falling snow and dying light at 240 meters off a wounded man's rifle. The reaction in the ops center was not applause. It was flat disbelief, and worse than disbelief, the ugly little smiles of men who assumed a legend was being built out of a lucky miss and a scared triggerman who'd simply fumbled the plunger. "That kind of shot doesn't happen," a staff officer said. "Not by her, not in those conditions." And that assumption would have buried the whole thing, filed it under battlefield rumor, if not for 3 cold pieces of proof that stacked up over the following days and refused to be argued with. The first was the recovered detonator itself, pulled from the causeway anchor by the clearance team. Intact, armed, its safety off, the plunger uncovered and ready under a dead man's thumb. A device that had been a quarter second from 100 funerals, not a fumble, not a misfire, a live trigger stopped by exactly one thing. The second was the body. A single entry wound, clean, precisely where a shot meant to stop a man's hands from working would need to land, at a range and in a light that no lucky round finds by accident. And the third was the feed. The scope Pharaoh had rigged to Brant's litter had recorded, and the ISR drone that reached the coast 20 minutes later had recorded, and when the two feeds were laid against the same time-stamped net traffic in a quiet room a week later, there it was, undeniable. Brant's voice saying now, "Inez," and 0.4 seconds later, the trigger man rising, and 0.3 seconds. After that, his fall. And no second shot, because there was no second shot, because there had only ever needed to be one. The staff officer who'd smiled watched the two feeds sink 3 times, and then stopped smiling and did not say anything at all, which is its own kind of admission. And the report was rewritten, and her name went into it not as Combs, but as the shooter of record, and the number beside it, 31 confirmed across 2 engagements, plus the 1 round on the causeway that saved 100 more, was entered as fact, because facts, in the end, are the one argument that doesn't care who is holding the rifle. Halloran came to find her on the 3rd day, in the armory, in the same doorway where it had started. She was returning Brant's rifle to its case, cleaning it one last time, hands moving without her eyes. Halloran stood in the doorway, and this time he did not fill it. He seemed smaller in it than she'd ever seen him, a big man made careful, and when he spoke, his voice had none of the room-filling certainty it had carried 4 days before. "I have to say a thing," he said, "and I'm going to do it badly." He stopped, started again. "When you reached for that case, I put my hand on it. I told a room full of men that you weren't a shooter. His jaw worked, and his eyes had gone red-rimmed and would not settle on her face, kept dropping to the rifle, to the floor. "I read your qual card, and I decided I knew you. 11 years I've been deciding who belongs in the line, and I've been right so many times I stopped checking, and I looked at you, and I saw—" He could not finish it. He put the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment, a man physically holding something in, and when he took it away, he was steadier and quieter and worse. "There were 16 men in that mud that morning who'd be alive if I'd been a better chief for years before it, and there were 100 people on that causeway who are alive because I finally had to say your name. I did that math about 400 times last night." He looked at her then, made himself do it, met her eyes over the rifle. "I was wrong about you in every way a man can be wrong about a person. I'm sorry. It's not enough. I know it's not enough." Inez set the rifle in its case and closed the lid, and she looked at him, and she did not make it easy for him, and she did not make it hard. She gave him the truth, which was all he'd asked for, in the fewest words it fit into. "You saw me," she said. "Now everyone did." That was all. Not forgiveness, not a wave of the hand, just the plain fact that the door he'd tried to hold shut had opened anyway and could not be closed again. Halloran nodded, took it, and it was more than he'd expected, and less than he'd hoped, and exactly what he'd earned. Lieutenant Commander Faber, who had run the ground element and who had known for 2 years that Halloran gate kept and had let it ride because Halloran got results and a quiet command was an easy command, came to her separately, because the recognition of a failure and the apology for it are 2 different acts. And a real chain of command does not let a corpsman and a chief carry them alone. He found her at the water's edge on the mainland shore, and he stood next to her for a long time before he could start. And when a Navy commander cannot start, it is because he is doing the arithmetic of every day he chose the easy thing. "I want to tell you it was Halloran," Faber finally said, looking at the gray water, not at her. "It'd be cleaner if it was just him. But I signed the Manning documents that put a national-level marksman in a comms billet and never read past the box that was empty. I heard him call you the clerk in my own briefings, and I let it be a joke because the room laughed, and a laughing room is an easy room to command. That's on him, and it's on me, and it's more on me, because I had the rank to fix it, and I used the rank to keep things quiet. He turned to her then, and there was a whole career reordering itself behind his eyes. That doesn't happen again on any line I run. Not to you. Not to the next one I can't see because her box is empty too. He'd already done the concrete thing before he came to say it, which is the only way an apology from a commander means anything. The orders were cut, her billet redesignated, her record corrected, a decoration submitted over his own signature that the staff would spend a year processing. But the part she'd remember was the recognition itself. 3 words he'd fought his whole rank to be able to say, the exact mirror of the sentence that had started all of it in that armory doorway. The long gun's hers, Faber said. 4 words. It undid Halloran's law completely, and it was official now, and it was true. Halloran spent the rest of that deployment proving the apology wasn't just weather. The moment that told everyone it had taken came a week later, not in a mess hall, not shielding her from a mocker. There was no mocker left, that was the point. But in the after-action review, in a room full of officers and analysts who had never been on the nail, when a visiting operations officer began, gently, professionally, to suggest that the causeway shot be recorded as a fortunate outcome, a scared enemy, a round that happened to land, because the officer did not want a legend in his data, and legends make bad doctrine. And Halloran, who 4 days before that morning would have agreed just to keep a woman off his line, stood up in that room without being asked and walked to the screen and put the 2 synced feeds up himself. And he made that room watch a wounded 24-year-old say now, Inez, and watch the trigger man rise and fall in the same second 3 times until the room was silent. And then he turned around and said, in the flat, certain voice he'd once used to shrink her and now used to defend her, "That's not luck. Luck doesn't come when a corpsman calls it, and a wounded kid times it, and a shooter waits for it. That's 3 people doing an impossible thing on purpose. And the shooter's name is Lindqvist. And if this review calls it luck, then this review is a lie, and I've told enough of those about her to last me." He sat down. The operations officer let it stand. It went into the record as a shot, not an accident. And that, a proud man spending his own credibility to bury the last comfortable lie about her, was the real apology, the one that cost, the one that changed the number in a file forever. The count settled in the end as a whole number that a clerk would enter, and a historian would question, and a survivor would never doubt. 31 enemy dead across the 2 engagements at the Nail, 16 in the first assault, and 14 more across the flanks and the long afternoon, and 1 on the causeway that did not go into the enemy tally at all, but into a separate line, the one that read 104 persons evacuated, no further casualties, 2 numbers, 31 and 104. Pharaoh, who had counted the first 16 out loud with his hands full of Brandt's blood, said later that people always asked him about the 31 and never about the 104, and that they had it exactly backwards. Ozzie Tran found her the day they left the Nail for good. He was still 18, still green, but he'd carried a rifle now and dragged a wounded man and watched the whole thing from 40 meters, and he didn't have the words for what he wanted to say any more than he'd had them at the range that first gray afternoon. So he just said the simplest true thing, the way witnesses do. "My mom asked me on the phone if I met anybody over here worth telling her about," he said, scuffing the wet stone, not looking at her. "And I told her about you. I told her there's a lady here everybody thought was nobody, and she's the reason 100 people got to go home, and I got to be one of them." He finally looked up. I didn't know how to say it better than that. Inez looked at the kid for a moment, and something in her face moved, just slightly, the one private crack in all that stillness. Because the thing that reaches a person like her is never the medal, or the review, or even the apology. It is a green boy telling his mother she was somebody. "That's how to say it," she told him. "Exactly like that." Brant lived. Of course he lived. She'd promised him he would, in the present tense, like the tide. He flew home ahead of the baby and made it with 3 weeks to spare. And in March there was a girl. And he did in fact teach her, some years on, to fish off a cold dock. And he told her the story exactly once when she was old enough. Not the count. Never the count. Only the part that mattered. That a woman everyone had told to run had grabbed his rifle instead. And that the last thing he'd done before the world went gray that morning was try to save her. And the truth was, she'd been saving all of them the whole time, and nobody had bothered to look at her long enough to know it. It was Brant, actually, who put the theme of the whole thing into the one sentence anyone ever needed, years later, when someone asked him how one person could have possibly held that causeway. "You can shout a person down," Brant said. "You can do it for 11 years. But you can't shout down a shot that lands. The rifle doesn't care what the chief thinks. The target's the only thing out there that never lies." Which was, though he never knew it, almost word for word, what an old biathlon coach named Petra Acra had been saying to a stubborn teenager on a freezing range for 11 winters, and which Inez had carried across an ocean into a war and paid out at last on a stone arch in the falling snow. The after-action report closed with the clinical dryness that all such reports use to hold the unbearable at arm's length. 2 engagements, 1 defensive position held, 1 shooter of record, 31 enemy killed, 1 hostile initiator neutralized at the causeway span at range 240 meters, 104 personnel recovered. No friendly losses in the second engagement. Engagement complete. The words sat on the page as if any of it had been ordinary. The last time anyone saw the enemy commander who had planned it all, he was a shape on a far ridge through a drone's eye. Watching the causeway he had been so certain would drown them. Watching 100 people walk off the island he had been so certain he owned. And whatever certainty had lived in him, the way it had once lived in Halloran, drained out of him in the space of that walk, because he had done the math exactly right and been beaten anyway, by the one variable no plan of his had thought to include, a small quiet woman whose file had an empty box where the truth should have been. He turned and went into the mountains, and the snow closed behind him. And Inez Lindqvist walked off the nail last, as she'd done everything without hurry. She carried her radio, because that had also been true the whole time. Both things at once. The batteries kept dry, and the long gun held. A person larger than the single box anyone had tried to file her in. At the mainland end, she stopped where the causeway met the shore, at the old stone arch, and looked back once across the drained flats at the island in the last gray light, with the snow coming down soft and even now that no one needed to be shot through it. Her breathing was slow. Her hands were still. Her eyes were level on the horizon. The way they'd been level on the flats the first afternoon, when a green kid spilled his water watching her. The way they'd been level down a rifle between two beats of a hammering heart with 100 lives on the round. She had nothing to prove to anyone anymore. And the strange thing was, she never had. The target had known the truth about her all along, had known it in Rue Polding and Antholz, and on a freezing firing point at the head of a northern inlet, because the target is the one honest thing, and it had answered her the same way every time, no matter who stood in the doorway telling her she couldn't. She shouldered her pack and turned inland and walked into the snow, small and quiet, and utterly at peace. A woman who had finally been seen and no longer needed to be, while 100 miles behind her a chief who had once put his hand on a rifle case and told a room she wasn't a shooter, sat with a synced video feed and watched, for the 400th time, the exact half-second his certainty had died, and, at last, let it.